Hey everyone, today on Big Out Books, I'm doing a February wrap-up. I have 9 books to talk about, although, as I've mentioned before, I'm currently teaching English, so nearly all of these books were books that I kind of had to read, not necessarily books that I would have chosen to read, so bear with me. It is a bit of a weird reading month. I had to read a lot of memoirs, which we are going to get into, and that is not usually my genre. So I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone, reading all sorts of weird things, and I'm here to report back. But I thought we'd start off this video with a book that I did actually choose for myself to read. This is a book that is well loved on BookTube, and I have been meaning to read this for a really long time, and that is the Victorian classic North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This book caught my interest very early on, within the first 30 pages, as there's a scene where the main character, Margaret, rejects a marriage proposal, and the scene is so cringy and awkward and uncomfortable. I found it so funny that I was just on board from that moment forward, and this book never disappointed me. Margaret was a fascinating person to follow around, even though you kind of know what the story is going to be going into this book. Like, you know that she's moving from the south of England, she has a lot of prejudices about why she thinks the South is better, and then she's going to move to the North, and she's not going to like it until she starts to know the people, and she's going to have this change of heart, and there's going to be a love story. Like, you just know what's going to happen in this book, but I still really enjoyed watching it all unfold, and I think part of that was the strength of the writing. I do think that Elizabeth Gaskell has a nice way with words. I was reading this while going through a bit of a stressful job transition, and I really appreciated how this book was such a comforting retreat from everything that was happening in my life, and I find that's kind of the case with Victorian fiction, since it's set in the past, and it's usually so wordy, and there's such an emphasis on a moving plot and story. So I liked that aspect about this book. It was just kind of a nice book to just step back from what was going on and get lost into this fictional world. So I am walking away from North and South with mostly positive feelings. I do appreciate that Elizabeth Gaskell was engaging with social justice issues from her time period, because a lot of Victorian authors kind of step back from that. So she is engaging with the costs of industrialization, some of the drawbacks of the rampant capitalism that England was seeing at the time. It did get a little bit preachy, sermon-y sometimes, but still I appreciate what she was trying to do, and I'm looking forward to continuing with some more Elizabeth Gaskell in the future. The next book we're going to talk about is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This was a reread for me. I first encountered this book when I was taking grade 10 English, and I really did not like this book. I had no time for it. But now I'm currently teaching grade 10 English, and what do you know? This book is still around. So I really wanted to go into this book with an open mind. And you know, maybe I've changed, right? I'm a better reader than I was over 10 years ago. And I'm sad to report back to you that I still don't really enjoy this book. It is never going to be a book that I will truly appreciate, and I think that's just because my worldview and my thoughts about, like, humanity are just so different than William Golding's that I find this book ridiculous in a lot of ways. On one hand, I understand why this book is still a staple in many English classes, since it's a book that can be so richly dissected. There are a lot of big philosophical ideas that you can play with in this book that can lead to some engaging class discussions about the structure of human societies and whether people are innately bad or good. But on the other hand, I don't like this book because I don't think that it's a very well-written novel. And I know that that's really subjective, and it's impossible to define what good writing is, but yet I feel like the prose in this book is nothing special. It is set on a lush island. The descriptive passages in this book should be gorgeous, and yet they aren't. There are no memorable descriptions in this book, and I find that most of the descriptive passages are really clunky and unclear, where I'm reading them through a couple times just to make sense of what happened, because the writing is not directly telling me. It's kind of obscure in a lot of ways. And the dialogue is also pretty rough in here. I mean, he is writing about teenage boys from a long time ago, so it's just really awkward. And there's just nothing great about the writing in this book. Personally, I think that if English teachers are going to continue to teach this book, mainly because of the ideas that it explores, we should consider showing the film instead, so that students can have access to the same storyline, characters, themes, and philosophical ideas without having to go through the rough experience experience of making it through this rocky prose. If I'm going to be having my students read a full novel, I want it to be one where they can experience the joy and the beauty that can be found in the written word. I want them to read descriptive passages that are evocative and memorable, or dialogue that is engaging and realistic. So that's just what it comes down to. I'd also love my students to be reading texts where the diversity of my classroom is a little bit better represented, and that's kind of another bummer about this book. Lord of the Flies only features British boys, and Golding takes this really narrow group of people and tries to represent their experiences as a microcosm for human society at large. And I find that that's unsuccessful because the group of people just aren't complex enough to represent how diverse the human experience can be. So for those reasons, I just don't really love this book, but I am still going to try to be as positive as I can while teaching it, because like I said, there are some interesting ideas in this book, and it is a pretty intense storyline, right? And at least there's always Simon. So those are my feelings looking back on this book. I'd love to hear more, whether you liked this book or didn't, or think that it should still be taught in schools. I think it's such an interesting discussion. Got a little worked up talking about that book. Gotta eat some mini eggs. Calm myself back down. The rest of the books that we're going to be talking about in this video are all memoirs, and that's not a genre that I typically go for because I find it a strange idea of trying to go back and process your life in a sequential, kind of linear order. Like, trying to impose narrative structure on your own life is sort of suspect. But anyway, these are the memoirs that I had to read. Some of them I loved, some of them were just okay, but I'm going to try to go through them quickly for you. One of the best memoirs that I read was Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. I had read his book Into the Wild a few years ago and was kind of lukewarm about it, but I did really enjoy this memoir. It's about a time in his life when he was brought on to a Mount Everest climbing expedition as a journalist, and it is well known for being a very disastrous climb, where a lot of the people that he was climbing with did not make it back down alive off the mountain. So it's an intense story, and the whole time you know that this disaster is looming ahead of you, so it makes it a pretty intense page turner. And Krakauer just is really emotionally affected by what he went through. He does feel some guilt for what happened to some of the people, so it's also just an interesting study about human nature and how people who climb mountains are kind of crazy. So here's one of the passages from the introduction. There were many, many reasons not to go, but attempting to climb Everest is intrinsically an irrational act, a triumph of desire over sensibility. Any person who would seriously consider it is almost by definition beyond the sway of reasoned arguments. The plain truth is that I knew better, but went to Everest anyway. And in doing so, I was a party to the death of good people, which is something that is apt to remain on my conscience for a very long time. So that's how this book starts off. It is intense all the way through. I did really enjoy this one, and no, I will never climb a mountain, especially Mount Everest, after reading this. The next memoir is a popular one, and that is The Glass Castle by Jeannette. This was a reread for me, but it had been over 10 years, so I knew that it was a book about an incredibly dysfunctional family, but I had forgotten some of the particular details. The parents in this book are legendarily frustrating. She has a father who has dreams of being this brilliant engineer scientist, but he's also kind of a drunk, and then her mother definitely has some kind of mental health issues going on, and also believes herself to be an artist, so doesn't want to be holding a steady job. So this family just kind of moves around from place to place, getting into trouble, packing up and leaving. So not a very stable childhood. I find it kind of frustrating how the father is portrayed as a much more sympathetic character, since Jeannette is so loyal to her dad throughout her childhood, and she really wants to believe in him. So we are kind of given some causes as to why he might be an alcoholic, and he just comes across in a much better light than the mother, who gets thrown under the bus for most of this book. And I think that that's kind of a trend that you see in a lot of books. People are just a lot harder on their moms for some reason, and I thought both parents kind of need to be held accountable for what happened to this family. Another thing about this book that didn't quite work for me is Jeannette is a journalist, and that's kind of the approach she takes with this book. She's very factual and detached, where she's saying, here's what happened in this order, and I would have preferred someone who's a little bit more emotional and sensitive, because I felt like that sense of internal feelings and thoughts were missing from this book. I really wanted to know more what was going on in the minds of these children and how this childhood affected them, because you just kind of skips forward to the future being like, yeah, most of us are fine now. So I would have liked this book to be a little bit different than it was, but still, it's still quite a remarkable story and definitely worth checking out. The next two books that I have to talk about are about two young people who are experiencing the Holocaust. So they are both very depressing and heartbreaking kind of reads. The first one is Night by Elie Wiesel. This is about his time as a young boy when he was sent to two different concentration camps. He survived them both, but he witnessed so much suffering and injustice and sorrow. It's incredible that this book is so slim. It's only around 120 pages, and yet so many terrible things happen, and that is what Elie Wiesel is doing here. He is bearing witness to the experiences that he went through because he can never forget what happened. His life was forever changed, and he wants to share that experience so that the world will never forget either. So this is a really powerful read. Even though it's really short, it is very haunting and intense. The other book is The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. This was a reread for me, but I was 12 when I last read it, so I enjoyed it then, but it just gets sadder and more poignant. I think the older that you are reading this book, these diary entries are truly incredible because Anne Frank is so perceptive. She's so great at writing about the people that she's living with and making these characters come to life, but she's so insightful when she's writing about her own thoughts and emotions, which are so relatable if you've gone through adolescence, especially when she worries about how she believes herself to be at the core, and yet how other people seem to perceive her differently, or she acts differently around other people. Like, I was just fascinated reading her thoughts, and this book is just so sad because it's impossible to take it out of context. And sometimes I wonder, what would this book read like if Anne Frank's family were never discovered? If this book was published and she had somehow survived the Holocaust, it would read very differently, but it becomes so sad when you know what's going to happen to Anne. And it doesn't happen in these diary entries, but you just know that this enthusiastic, bright, brilliant young person who is so positive and optimistic about the future is not going to have a future, and that is just really depressing, and that's very hurtful. So, you read passages like this. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. Like, passages like that are going to break your heart. I recently read an article by Elie Wiesel, the author of Night, where he talks about why The Diary of Anne Frank is such an enduring classic, but he does question whether the positive outlook of her diary would change if she continued to write while living in a concentration camp. After experiencing so much suffering and witnessing so much cruelty, would that shake her positive faith in humanity? Because that's what it did for him. Going through the concentration camp experience completely shattered his view of the world and whether people were good. So he wonders whether people are somewhat deluding themselves reading this book, because we all kind of want to believe that people are good, even though there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. So it's an interesting question, and one that we will never know the answer to. But we are incredibly fortunate to have her diary entries. Anne Frank left behind an incredible body of work. I mean, can we talk about how amazing it is that she keeps this content fresh and engaging, even though her family's in hiding and they're not allowed to go anywhere or really do much, and yet she still keeps you interested and wanting to turn the pages just by the sheer force of her personality and the strength of her insights. So this is a truly remarkable read. The next memoir I have is Open Heart, Open Mind by Clara Hughes. She is a Canadian athlete who's best known for earning medals in the Winter Olympics for speed skating and also in the Summer Olympics for cycling. So I did read this while the Winter Olympics were happening, so it felt kind of topical, felt like the right time of year to be reading this. Clara opens up about her dysfunctional family and her struggles with mental health. You really do see how the intense focus that it takes to become a successful Olympian athlete can also really mess with your self-esteem and with your mental health. So this is an eye-opening book. I do not usually enjoy books about sports, but I have to say that this was a pretty insightful memoir, and it was all right. The next book that I have to talk about is legitimate trash, so I really don't want to talk about it a lot because I'm just going to work myself up into a frenzy, but that was Seriously, I'm Kidding by Ellen Degeneres. Now you have to understand where I'm coming from. I was reading memoirs about people who had climbed Mount Everest or were living through the freaking Holocaust, so this is not a memoir of that caliber. It's actually not a memoir. It's like a random collection of jokes, half-baked ideas that are kind of thrown together. Now, I thought Ellen did come out with her sexuality at a time when that was still pretty uncommon, so I thought maybe she has a story to tell here. But no, this book does not deal with that. This is actually her third book, so there were not a lot of ideas in the tank when she wrote this book. There is nothing in this book remotely resembling insight, nor did I find it very entertaining, and I feel like none of the jokes landed, so for me, this was just a complete fail, and I just kind of got angry when I was reading it, and also sad when I thought about how many copies that this is going to sell when there are so many more deserving books that you could be reading instead, so The last memoir that I read was Fun Home, a family tragicomic by Alison Bechtel. I've been meaning to read some more graphic memoirs for a while because I feel like it's such an engaging way to tell your life story. So Fun Home is about Alison Bechtel's relationship with her father, who has died, and also about her father's sexuality and her coming to terms with her own sexuality. Also, there are a lot of literary references in this book, so it's pretty nerdy. Sometimes I felt the literary comparisons were like a little bit too forced, but still I enjoyed this for the most part. I also like the idea on reflecting back on your childhood and how our parents are so much weirder than we have any idea about as we're living through our childhood. Like, we don't really understand our parents until we're older through hindsight, and even then it's still a little bit of a mystery. So those were the books that I read in February. I've finished most of my required reading for my courses, so hopefully going forward in the months to come I will be choosing more of what I want to be reading. Although after reading Fun Home, I have definitely started a big kick into reading graphic novels, so foreshadowing, you're going to see a lot of those in my March wrap-up. And if you have any suggestions for awesome graphic novels, please let me know because I am on the lookout for those right now. So thank you for watching. I hope that your reading is going well, and I will see you next time.